When a customer mistreats an employee, Clint Eastwood steps in, and what happens next will leave everyone speechless. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you love powerful stories like this, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we've got another unforgettable story just for you. In the everyday chaos of a local market, John, a young worker with Down syndrome, struggled to stay calm on his first day at work. But the peace was shattered when an angry customer began humiliating him with cruel words. While everyone around watched in silence, unwilling to step in, no one knew that among the customers, a famous Hollywood actor was observing the scene, and what he did next would leave everyone speechless. John was a 21-year-old young man with Down syndrome, and despite his infectious energy and kind spirit, he faced many struggles. His past had left deep scars that affected his self-esteem and how he saw the world. His relationship with his stepfather had been cold and abusive, and the words his stepfather used to say, "You'll never amount to anything," echoed in John's mind daily. The memory of those harsh words seemed to haunt him, no matter how much he tried to overcome them. John's first day at work in the local market was supposed to be a fresh start. He had worked hard to land the job, and now it was time to prove to himself and others that he was capable of more than just the image people often placed on him. With his uniform on and a hopeful smile, John walked through the market's automatic doors. He was ready for the day, filled with excitement and nerves, but he didn't know that the real test was just about to begin. At first, things went as expected. He met his manager, Jack, who welcomed him warmly and introduced him to the various tasks. John was eager to learn, diligently following every instruction Jack gave him. He had been assigned tasks like organizing products, bagging groceries, and helping customers with their purchases. Even though John's pace was slower than most of the other employees, he did everything with sincerity, determination, and a sense of pride in his work. What he didn't know was that his colleagues, though not openly rude, were already casting discreet glances at him, judging his slower pace and making comments behind his back. "He's a bit slow, don't you think?" one of the co-workers whispered quietly, unaware that John overheard it. John, trying his best to ignore the comments, simply kept working. He was used to being judged for things beyond his control. Despite the whispers, John kept his head down and focused on doing his best. By the end of the day, though exhausted, John felt proud of what he had accomplished. He had made it through his first shift, completed all his tasks, and felt ready for the days ahead. Little did he know the next moment would change everything. As John finished bagging the last customer's groceries, he let out a sigh of relief. His shift was almost over, and everything had gone smoothly. But before he could breathe a sigh of true relief, the automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss, and a woman entered. Her sharp, forceful footsteps echoed across the store, signaling the arrival of someone who would soon disrupt the peace. Karen, a 45-year-old woman with a rigid posture and an air of evident superiority, strode into the store with impatience radiating from her every step. She was immediately annoyed by the setup of the store, muttering loudly about its disorganization as she maneuvered her cart through the aisles. Her impatience was palpable. She moved briskly through the aisles, grabbing products without care, tossing them into her cart without considering other customers. Any obstacle, like another person trying to compare prices or a child standing in her way, was met with a sharp glare or a frustrated sigh. John, unaware of the storm that was approaching, continued his work at the register. He greeted Karen with a polite smile and a soft, "Good morning, ma'am." But Karen's response was far from polite. She glared at him and muttered under her breath, "I hope it's good because I don't have all day." John's nerves began to fray, but he pushed on, scanning Karen's items with care and double-checking the codes. He was doing his best to avoid any mistakes, but no matter what he did, Karen's piercing gaze remained on him. Each movement he made was met with an exaggerated sigh, and she began tapping her fingers impatiently on the counter. Her cold voice cut through the air like a blade. "Is this going to take long? Honestly, I feel like I'm watching this in slow motion." John's face flushed a deep red. He could feel the weight of her words, each one heavier than the last. His hands trembled as he hurried to finish the transaction, trying his best to move faster. But the faster he tried to go, the more mistakes he made. His nervousness only worsened, and when a package slipped from his hand and fell to the floor, the sound seemed to amplify the awkwardness and embarrassment he was feeling. "Oh my God, he can't even hold a bag," Karen sneered loudly, seeking validation from the other customers. John's breathing grew shallow as he tried to regain control, but the damage had already been done. The weight of Karen's cruel words and the murmurs of the customers around him were unbearable. Karen's cruel remarks grew louder and more frequent. With each passing moment, John's sense of self-worth seemed to unravel. He was used to harsh words from his past, his stepfather's voice echoing in his mind, telling him he was useless, a burden, someone who would never amount to anything. But this time, it was different. This wasn't just his stepfather's voice. This was a woman in front of him, humiliating him in front of an entire line of customers, showing no mercy. "You shouldn't be working here if you can't handle something as simple as bagging groceries," Karen spat, her voice dripping with disdain. John's hands began to tremble uncontrollably. He tried to stay focused, but the words stung. His mind began to race, thoughts flashing back to his painful childhood memories of feeling small and insignificant. Karen's voice cut through him like a razor, the words piercing through his defenses. His thoughts spiraled, and before he knew it, another bag slipped from his hands and fell to the floor with a loud thud. John bent down quickly to pick it up, but the humiliation was unbearable. The sounds of the store around him seemed to fade as Karen's voice grew louder, as if she were the only one speaking. "Someone needs to teach you how to do a real job," Karen sneered. "You're holding everyone up." The words hit John like a physical blow. He could feel his throat tighten, his body growing weak under the pressure of the moment. But in the midst of his breakdown, something shifted. The crowd, once silent and passive, began to murmur among themselves. A few customers shifted uneasily, realizing that what was happening wasn't right. But no one had yet found the courage to intervene. John tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He opened his mouth, his voice trembling, barely audible. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I'm trying." But Karen wasn't listening. She continued her tirade, focusing entirely on him as if he were the cause of her frustration. At that moment, John felt utterly alone, as if he were drowning in a sea of cruel words. But just as he thought he might collapse under the weight of it all, something unexpected happened. The crowd around John was beginning to notice the escalating tension. Most customers were either recording the scene on their phones or avoiding eye contact, unwilling to step in. But one man, standing quietly at the back of the line, had been watching the entire ordeal unfold. His calm posture, his steady gaze, there was something about him that drew people's attention. As Karen's verbal assault on John continued, the man stepped forward with quiet authority. He was calm, but his presence was undeniable. He crossed the aisle toward the checkout line, his eyes locked on Karen. The room seemed to hold its breath as the man closed the distance. Karen, clearly caught off guard, turned to face him, irritation visible in her eyes. "And you think you can just show up here and tell me how to act?" she snapped. The man didn't flinch. His voice was firm yet calm as he spoke. "I'm not telling you how to act. I'm saying that what you're doing right now is wrong." There was a moment of stunned silence. The other customers, now fully aware of the situation, shifted their attention away from John and onto the new figure in the scene. The man continued to walk toward Karen, unwavering. John, still frozen behind the counter, watched with wide eyes, not fully understanding why this man was standing up for him. But for the first time, he felt something shift. He wasn't alone. The man, now close to John, turned his gaze to him. His voice softened. "John, you're doing a great job here. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." John's heart swelled with a sense of relief. For the first time in a long time, he felt seen. Not for his disability or his perceived shortcomings, but for his efforts. The words were simple, but they carried so much weight. The man's presence seemed to steady the room, and as Karen faltered in her defense, the other customers began to murmur in agreement. Slowly, the power dynamic shifted. The crowd, once passive, now began to turn against Karen. They were no longer silent bystanders. Some began to speak out, supporting the man's intervention. The atmosphere in the store shifted almost instantly. A ripple of unease spread through the crowd as Clint Eastwood's voice rang out, unwavering and deliberate. At first, the other customers merely observed, but then, like embers catching fire, their murmurs turned into voices of dissent. "He doesn't deserve that," a woman declared, her voice carrying over the checkout lines. "He's doing his job like the rest of us. We're all waiting, and no one else is acting like this. Why should you?" The tension in the air fractured, giving way to a wave of quiet agreement. People nodded, exchanged glances, and some even stepped forward, their presence alone a silent rebuke to Karen's cruelty. The once oppressive silence was now charged with something new: solidarity. Clint turned back to John, his expression softening. "John," he said, his voice steady but kind, "never let people like this make you doubt yourself. You're more than enough. Always have been." John blinked, his breath hitching in his throat. His hands trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Validation. The shame that had clung to him for so long, the quiet resignation he had carried, began to loosen its grip. For the first time in what felt like forever, John stood a little taller. He wasn't just enduring, he was seen. And that, perhaps, was the greatest gift Clint had given him. As Clint stepped out of the store, the air inside felt different, lighter, charged with an unspoken understanding. What had begun as a moment of confrontation had transformed into something more, a collective reckoning. The customers, once passive onlookers, were now united in silent agreement. They had seen injustice unfold before their eyes, and for once, they had not simply let it happen. Karen stormed out moments later, her face flushed with indignation, but the applause that erupted behind her made it clear. She had lost more than an argument. She had lost the silent approval she had always counted on. The sound wasn't just for Clint. It was for something bigger. It was for the simple act of doing what was right. Meanwhile, John stood behind the register, still trying to process everything. The echoes of encouragement, the warmth of strangers who had once overlooked him. It all felt surreal. He had spent so long blending into the background, believing that was where he belonged. But now, people saw him. And not just as the boy with a disability, not just as the cashier struggling through his shift, but as a person worthy of respect. As his shift neared its end, the kindness continued. A woman, her eyes bright with sincerity, leaned in and whispered, "You're doing great, John. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." An older man, who had watched everything unfold, placed a steady hand on John's shoulder. "Keep it up, son," he said, his voice rich with admiration. "You've got more courage than most people out there." John's fingers curled around the edge of the counter, grounding himself in this moment where, for the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt seen. He wasn't invisible. He wasn't just enduring. He was standing, head high, shoulders back, carrying with him the quiet but undeniable weight of newfound confidence. And as he smiled, a small but genuine smile, it was clear that something had changed. Not just in the store, not just in the people around him, but in John himself. John's story didn't end in the market that day. It was only the beginning. The incident, captured on shaky phone cameras, spread like wildfire across social media. Within hours, Clint Eastwood's stand against cruelty had gone viral. Millions watched, shared, and commented, inspired by the simple yet powerful act of speaking up. But it wasn't just a trending topic. It became a wake-up call. People began to examine their own actions, questioning how often they had stood by in silence when someone was mistreated. They realized that kindness wasn't just about grand gestures. It was in the small moments, the quiet decisions to uplift rather than tear down. For John, the impact was even more profound. The next day, As he stepped into the market, something was different. The weight he had carried for so long felt lighter. Customers who had once overlooked him now greeted him with warm smiles and encouraging words. Some even went out of their way to stop by his register, not just to make a purchase, but to acknowledge him. "You're an inspiration, John," one man said, shaking his hand. A mother with her young daughter leaned in and whispered, "You remind me to be brave." John wasn't just a cashier anymore. He had become a symbol of resilience, of quiet strength, of what could happen when people chose to see rather than ignore. And for the first time in a long while, he no longer felt invisible. He no longer doubted his worth. He belonged, and he knew it. From a painful moment, John found his own strength, not only thanks to Clint Eastwood, but also thanks to ordinary people who chose to stand up for what was right. He was no longer the boy who was always afraid of others' eyes, but became a symbol of courage and perseverance. Life went on, and John knew that there would be more challenges ahead. But this time, he no longer felt alone. He learned that the value of a person is not in speed or perfection, but in their heart and effort. And this is just one of countless stories about kindness, struggle, and small but meaningful changes in life. If you found this story touching your heart, please like to spread this message to more people. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next meaningful stories. See you tomorrow with another emotional story.